Hello, I want to talk with you about the neuroscience of language development with a particular focus on bilingualism. So first, just to clarify that learning to understand another language changes the brain physically. And this study is just showing you that before a specific language training, this is the areas of the brain that were being activated. And after training, the same assessments activated different areas of the brain. So we're physically changing the brain anytime we learn something new, including languages. The brain never stops changing. You know that because when babies are little, they have a little brain, right? And it grows, it gets bigger as they get older. We're born with most of the neurons that will have about 86 billion neurons, plus or minus 8 billion. So I could have 8 billion fewer neurons than you and still be fully functional and happy human, okay? So there's a lot of variability in brains. And the brain is shaped as a result of both biology and experience. Our genes are turning on and off all the time based on our environmental input, based on our experiences. And here's this example of Otto and Ewald, identical twins who do not look identical because they have different epigenetic, different environmental influences. As you can see, Ewald has a lot of weight training. Otto doesn't. Okay, so this is what it looks like in the brain to have our neurons change based on experience. So here's a little baby brain, right? And you can see each of these is a neuron. The black circle is a soma or cell body. The long skinny line is the axon. The small skinny lines are dendrites. And you can see we're not changing from birth to age, here we go, to age 2 over here. It's not changing the number of neurons. You can see about the same number of little black circles in all these pictures, but what's changing is the number of connections. Neural connections proliferate in early childhood as a result of experiences, and some of those connections will only grow if we have certain experiences. That's called experience-dependent plasticity. So now these overcrowded connections, as you can see in this 2-year-old brain, are really inefficient. And you can think of it this way. You're trying to get from point A to point B, and how are you going to get there? It's like you got to hack your way with the machete through the jungle to get your path clear, right? That's why it takes kids forever to do anything. Don't be mad at them. It takes longer because they got this jumble of connections in their brain. And this is why the Family Circus cartoon makes so much sense, right? They're going all over the place to get from point A to point B. That's what happens in the brain that has too many neural connections. So what do? We prune those underused connections away. And so here you have that baby brain, and then at age 7, super crowded, and then at age 15, fewer connections. Now, this isn't like bad, like adolescents lose all their connections. That's what's happening. No, this is efficiency, improving efficiency. Think about it like going from a sparse desert to a trail here to a superhighway here. The superhighway is super, super efficient. It gets you there fast and it doesn't use a lot of real estate to do it. So remember, whenever we do anything repeatedly, we create our brain's physical structure. And this is just a picture showing you of some myelinated axon tracks. It's a 3D print, which is pretty fun. And the myelin is the insulation. It's actually a living cell. It's not fat that wraps around axons. It's a glial cell called an oligodendrocyte. You can impress your family by telling them oligodendrocyte when you see them next. So the main thing to remember from this is use it or lose it. As Dr. Montessori said, every unnecessary aid is an obstacle to development. The child needs to exert themselves on the world so they can develop their neural connections. We already have strong neural connections. So we need to back out and not keep getting in the way. Let them do it. And in neuroscience terms, we say practice makes permanent. So here's a first quiz. See if you can answer this correctly. We're born with most of the neurons we'll have. True or false? The answer is true. We are born with most of the neurons we'll ever have, about 86 billion, plus or minus 8 billion. Okay, another one. Anything we do repeatedly, the brain learns to do more efficiently. True or false? True is the answer. So whether you're doing yoga or meditation to heal yourself, to generate well-being, to calm yourself in tricky situations, or whether you're going to eat more cookies, either one of them, your brain is going to get more efficient at doing that. So be mindful of what you choose to do repeatedly. Your brain will get really good at it and want to do it automatically. It's why it's harder to break bad habits. So here's an example of repetition in a little child. I'm just going to show you a few seconds of this and just watch how many times she's putting on her socks. And on it goes. And off it goes. And there's a lot going on around her, right? She doesn't care. On it goes. And oh, now the other one too. She's putting that on. And she keeps going. She keeps going. So I'll tell you that if we watch the whole video, you'd see this for about 17 times that she takes them on and off. That's all she wants to do. She just is practicing that skill. She's mastering it. She's creating strong neural connections. And we need this repeated experience because we have to wire our distant brain networks into efficient connectivity networks. It's by repeatedly doing it that we're making those superhighways, right? And here's just an example of functional connectivity during a language-based task. Look at all the areas of the brain that have to work together. This is the left, the right, all these areas have to coordinate. So many different spots in the brain, right? So we need strong neural connections. As you master a skill, the brain becomes more efficient at using that skill. It creates a strong network for it. So this example shows you how much brain real estate it takes to do something we're not really good at yet. And here you can see in this 11-year-old brain, all these orange and maroon spots are showing you the areas of the brain that the child needs in order to read, okay? They're not as efficient as an adult reader. They use a lot of brain areas. But look at when we're older and efficient readers, we use a lot less real estate to get something done. So just remember that when we're first thinking about what a child is able to do and not able to do, they need so many more cognitive resources in order to be able to do something that we can do without even thinking about it, right? So we need more patience with the little ones. It takes them longer. It's a lot more effort to do things for us that are effortless. So I want to talk about these networks a little more. They're really important for reading. And again, we wire these distant areas into efficient networks, and you need your whole brain to do anything. I think that's starting to become apparent, although there are certain networks, nodes, and hubs that tend to be focal areas for different activities. So here's some networks that we use for attention. So our alerting attention uses all these areas of the brain. Orienting attention tends to use these areas. Executive attention, a lot of frontal activity, but you can see it's not just frontal, there's other things happening, right? A lot of different areas for different networks. And if we think about movement, amazingly, movement and cognition areas are like totally intertwined. They're really closely connected. What's going on with that, right? Our movement areas are intrinsically connected with our thinking regions. And when we have really good frontal motor area connectivity, we think faster. Okay, movement, really important. And this is really important for bilingualism as well. And here you can see the movement brain areas are part of the networks for bilingualism. You can't separate these things out. They're really connected. So answer for yourself this question. First of all, do you monitor your step count each day thinking about movement? Did you exercise this morning, or will you definitely exercise later today? Do you want to exercise but you find it hard to make time? Or you think exercise is overrated? Which one are you? Okay, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit more. Exercise is both neuroprotective and neuroregenerative. Okay, big words. What it means is that when we exercise, our body makes all this yummy stuff for the brain, like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, glial-derived neurotrophic factor, all these great things, okay, that the brain really needs to work well. And that, in turn, affects the functioning of the entire body. When the brain works well, it can support the rest of the body's function too. Okay, so with that in mind, ask yourself, what does the importance of movement and thinking mean for our children, right? What does it mean? How long should they be sitting still? How long should we be sitting still, right? We really need to keep ourselves moving to keep our body and brain working at optimal levels. So now let's look at the networks for reading. And you can see for reading, we use the entire brain, right? Okay, first we have to see something that's happening that's before us, the text we're reading. Then we have to recognize its letter strings, that they have sounds. And we have to find it or forge it in our lexicon, in our internal dictionary. And we respond either vocally or subvocally. And that's why you can kind of hear reading in your head, even if you're not reading out loud. You can hear yourself reading just in your head. Your internal editor is creating those sounds. So think about this. It's like a reading committee. We need all these different parts of the brain to work together. Have you ever been on a committee, right? Like they get nothing done, right? It's ridiculous. Okay, so that's how much effort it takes and how much work it takes for us to read, and we're really efficient at it. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about the child who's learning to read in their first or their second language. There's a huge cognitive demand there. We need to be respectful of that. Okay, so when we learn different languages, we actually use different parts of the brain. Some of the brain areas are the same, and some of them are slightly different. And you can see here these examples from English and Italian. These networks are used in both those languages, and English is partially phonetic, Italian's phonetic, both alphabetic languages. But here there's some differences, even in those languages that we may think of as quite similar. And now that you can see similar differences even when you're looking at logographic languages versus alphabetic languages, so character-based languages or alphabetic-based languages, okay? There are similarities and there are differences among them all. And here is a really good example for a character-based language, a logographic language. Chinese is really using a lot of Broca's area, a bigger area in this middle frontal gyrus, right? That's a big word for you. It doesn't really matter. But this part of the brain we're using a lot of. And then in English or French or Italian, we're using also Broca's area, but we're also using some other areas as well. Okay, so similarities and differences based on which language we're learning. Learning a language changes our brain in different ways depending upon the language we learn. That's so cool. And when you learn also changes how you learn. So when you're younger, it's easier and effortless to develop a really great accent, the native accent for that language. And your memory is a little more important for you than our analytical skills. You're just remembering everything. But when we get older, we may need a little phonemic training to improve our accent or our speech. And our analytical skills are actually more important than our memory. You could still learn a language really quickly if you're older, actually possibly even faster than a young child, depending on how you apply yourself, right? You can learn a language at any age, and you just may need to change your level of effort that's involved. Now, code switching, which is the mixing of vocabulary or grammatical rules across languages, is not a problem. As we said, when we're older, analytical skills come more into play with learning a language, and we'll be analyzing those grammar similarities and differences, right, or vocabulary similarities and differences, right? And when you're younger, you don't analyze it so much, you just embody it, you just remember it, okay? These sort themselves out as we get more language experience. So don't worry about it if you have a student or a child who's mixing them, or if you are yourself, you're speaking a little Spanglish, it's okay. When you're first developing that fluency, it's a normal part of the process. Grammar will develop equally well at all ages. So that's something to keep in mind. You can really and truly learn a language perfectly at any age. Your accent might just need a lot more help when you learn it older. Okay, so why is that the case? This is about plasticity, which is the capacity of the brain to change. The reason it's easier for us to learn when we're younger, but we can still learn when we're older, is because of plasticity. Let me show you what I mean by that. So here on the bottom of this graph, you see age going across the bottom. And up here is the amount of plasticity that we have. Now you can see when we're little, we have tons of effortless plasticity. Right here, boom, tons. But as we get older, that effortless plasticity decreases, right? And instead, we develop effortful plasticity. This is the physiologic effort we have to make in order to enhance our neural connections. So you can see plasticity is with us throughout our lifespan, but we might need to just apply ourselves a little more as we get older. There are two main ways we learn languages. One is simultaneously. So that's often, you think of that when you think of an infant or a young child who's just immersed in the language, and we just learn both languages at the same time, okay? It's not like we learn one first and we learn one second. That's sequential learning. And a lot of us who are monolingual in childhood and then acquire a second or third language later in life, we're sequential learners. And usually simultaneous learning results in better acquisition sooner, but both can lead to total fluency. So again, it's easier when we introduce them younger, but as we get older, we still have the possibility of total fluency. So don't be discouraged no matter how old you or your children are. Just start and get going. So about 20% of the US is bilingual, simultaneous bilingual, whereas 50% of the world is. So in our culture, in this country, we're just not recognizing the value of simultaneous bilingualism. If you have the possibility of doing that in your own life, just do it. It's so good. You'll learn more about how great it is for the brain. All of this, no matter what we're talking about, which language, monolingual, bilingual, it all starts with spoken language. That's the most important part of learning a language, is the foundation. So don't overlook it and don't underestimate it. Sometimes we jump ahead into reading or writing. Get your spoken language foundations on strong. And the first part of spoken language is being able to hear the sounds in a language. And that actually predicts future literacy, because if you speak other languages, you might recognize that there are some sounds in some languages that just aren't in others. Like the and sound in English just aren't in Japanese. So we'll talk more about that, but it's very difficult for us to train our auditory cortex to recognize things when it happens later in life. But we can still do it. So in all languages, we learn via social relationship. And here's my friend and his baby here. And look, they're just gabbling at each other. Even from that tiny age, they're doing it together, the serve and return. And you want to do that because social interactions act as a gate for infants' initial language learning, right? We can't have language without social relationships. And our vocabulary develops based on both exposure and opportunity. And opportunity in research, they call it conversational turns, right? And here's some classic research from Hart and Risley showing that there is a socioeconomic equity issue at play here, where children in more wealthy families tend to have greater vocabulary exposure than children in less wealthy families. And that, I believe, is due to stress. Because when you're poor, there is stress, and stress is really bad for the brain. We're going to talk about that. But the more conversational turns that happen also really matter. It's not just that the kids hear language, it's that they have the opportunity to participate in language. And that's what this research shows. So children should be seen but not heard. That old aphorism is a little problematic for language development. Instead, I think Nelson Mandela had it right. He said, "It's my deepest conviction that the children should be seen and heard as our most treasured assets." So that statement agrees with neurodevelopmental research more than the old aphorism. So our ear for sound actually develops in infancy. And I'm talking specifically here about the myelination of the auditory cortex. And that we only develop myelin where we need it in the auditory cortex when we have experiences that encourage the myelin to develop it. It's actually similar in the visual cortex. So we need to hear language. We need to hear human language in order for those axonal tracts to really get strong and develop that strong myelin that they need to have efficient communication later in life. And this myelin is forming up until around age 6, and then things slow down a lot as far as myelin in the auditory cortex goes. Bilingualism is awesome for the auditory cortex, okay? It enhances our auditory processing and overall cognitive processing, regardless of wealth, regardless of socioeconomic status, okay? So this is huge. Bilingualism may turn out to be a great equalizer when you think about equity. So here's a great research study by Patricia Kuhl. She has a tremendous body of research she's been doing in this area. And she did this study was to test whether live exposure or recorded television exposure, screen exposure to another language would have the same effect, okay? And this research showed that the children who received who had a session every week with a live student, native speaker. These are graduate students. You can see it's the same graduate student was speaking live or recorded, reading a book, okay? And the children who showed up live for that, they were able to hear the sounds and language. But the children who saw it on TV, no change. They couldn't see it, okay? And this is really key. Not only does it show us that human relationship is needed for language learning and that the screens are really not where we need to be going in early childhood. It's not the plan. Later in life, screens can be great help, okay? But early childhood, not so much, okay? But it also showing us right here, it's this interactivity. This child is engaged in the story. She's pointing and the child is pointing. The child's like, oh, what's happening? And maybe babbling at that same time, okay? It's this conversational turn, the interactivity, the child's ability to engage in conversation that really helps their auditory cortex development and their ability to hear the sounds and language. So this research is pointing to a sensitive period for phonemic awareness development. The sensitive period for the brain to hear the sounds and language. Now, it's not just our ear that has to hear. Our ear has to then communicate that information to the brain, okay? So it seems like if you get exposure between the ages of 6 and 12 months to these great richness of sounds in different languages, you'll be able to hear them more likely when you're older and hopefully able to pronounce them as well, okay? So sensitive periods are telling us there are optimal times in development where certain things happen. It doesn't mean it's exclusive, that those sensitive windows can't reopen later, but generally our brain is really interested in phonemic awareness between the ages of 6 to 12 months, really interested in sensory input in infancy, and motor and language development in childhood, and then higher cognition when we get into adolescence. That's what the brain is working on developing and naturally driven to engage in activities like that, which is why Montessori always says follow the child, because the child has this innate drive. It's a biological drive to meet the needs of these sensitive periods. All right, here's a quiz. Social interactions and relationships are less important than academics and education. True or false? False. Human relationships dramatically influence the developing brain's physical structure. Oh, yeah. All right, now learning to speak is a natural biological process, okay? And we can see this in other vertebrates, right? You can see the bird, right? This beautiful zebrafinch has similar actual areas in the brain for listening and for producing language, for singing in the bird, okay? So it's normal evolution for us to learn to hear and speak, all right? Just the act of learning to speak and hear makes our brain change. It's experience dependent plasticity, okay? So again, need to have the child actively engaged. So which of the following activities do you think will help spoken language development? Let's see. Natural conversation, taking turns speaking? Yes. Reading books out loud together? Yes, they're hearing all the sounds in the language. Singing songs? Absolutely. Rhythm and prosody have so much to do with language. Reciting poems for the same reason. Plus, if you memorize the poems, they start to get excited about memorizing things. Playing I Spy or sound games definitely helps because it isolates the sounds and language. I spy with my little eye, something that starts with the sound. Taking turns talking about your day. Absolutely. Helps with relationship and it lets them engage in language. Telling stories about when you were a child. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But try to err on the side of the positive stories. If you talk about the mischief, spin it in a positive light, okay? Try to stay away from the really difficult stories. Don't pretend those things didn't happen, but as the child gets older, it's more appropriate and they're more capable of handling that information. Explaining what you are doing while you are doing it. This is super important, especially with infants. So as you're changing them, you can say, okay, I'm taking this shirt off. We need to lift your right arm and then your left arm. Now we'll put your right sock on and now your left sock on. That kind of explanatory conversation can be super helpful for the young child. Trying to recite tongue twisters, it's totally my favorite. Just do it right now. Red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather, red leather, yellow leather. It's hard. It's great fun. Okay, so recognizing speech uses different brain areas than recognizing print. This probably makes sense to you already. And you can see these images are showing you areas that are active for recognizing speech greater than when we're at rest. And these areas are active greater when we're reading print than when we're at rest. But look at the overlap. This is key. Co-activation, right? There's some correlation, but here's co-activation. And this is why spoken language is so important, because the areas for print, for reading print, rely completely on those areas for recognizing speech, okay? And speech is foundational for reading in any language. It's not just in English or Chinese, it's in Hebrew, it's in Spanish, it's all languages, okay? They have the same reliance on those speech recognition areas for reading. So how does the brain learn to read? We know it's going to involve all these networks. Well, some of our language networks are biologically programmed to develop. And you can see these axonal tracks. So these are myelinated axons that are running from this part of the brain to this part of the brain. It's called the arcuate fasciculus. And it's really just biology just makes it happen, okay? This is a little different. If you have a family history of dyslexia, you can see that the arcuate fasciculus is a little different. So that's biology, right? This is, I think these children were 18 months or younger. So it's not an environment. No one's taught them to read yet. And yet there's a biological difference for them if they have this disposition for dyslexia. So has evolution prepared us to read? It's already programmed to send out these arcuate fasciculus tracks. But is it prepared us to read? No, as it turns out, it has not, right? We actually have to change part of our brain called the visual word form area into an area that is good at recognizing letters because it's programmed to be good at recognizing faces. So when we learn to read, we actually lose a little bit of our ability to recognize faces and instead develop this ability to recognize letters. That's called neuronal recycling, where we take a part of the brain and recycle its original intention for another use. So learning to read requires training, and it requires this physiologic change in the brain. And this visual word form area gets transformed whether you're learning an alphabetic language or a character-based language, okay? It's the same for both. And it's just the process of learning to read that actually creates our VWFA and our neural reading networks. And again, I want to say there's just a difference in our neural networks. They develop differently if we have dyslexia. So here you can see that the brain regions we use less in dyslexia are similar in English or in Chinese, okay? So there are some brain regions that are just underactive in dyslexia, and it doesn't matter which language. They seem to be underactive in all languages. Now, why do I keep talking about dyslexia? Because many of us are working with it either in ourselves or in our family, and it has gifts as well as challenges. So don't get all discouraged like, oh, I've got dyslexia, it's over, or she has dyslexia and it's going to be so hard for her. Yes, it will be harder, but that doesn't mean you can't excel in a reading intensive field. And I point to this research by Rosalie Fink out of Lesley University in Boston, and she investigated why so many Nobel Prize winning laureates who were in sciences were able to win the Nobel Prize. How could they persist when they had severe dyslexia? And she found that it was because they were so interested in the subject matter that they kept going at it because they had to know. They wanted to know. So if we can develop interest in ourselves or in our students and our children, we can really help them overcome challenges they make, because interest is like the golden key that opens all doors. Okay, here's a quiz. If your child has dyslexia, they should not learn another language. True or false? The answer is false. Reading uses different neural networks in dyslexia, all languages, and language exposure, any language, helps strengthen and activate our neural networks. Is there a delay with bilingualism? This is a common question that comes up. Bilinguals and monolinguals both produce their first words at around the same age, 10 to 12 months. So that doesn't seem to be a delay if you're talking about simultaneous language acquisition. And acquiring a language in early childhood is associated with both accelerations and delays. Some things that seem to accelerate are executive function development. And think about it. You're speaking with grandma. Grandma speaks this language. But when you speak with dad speaks this language, language B, grandma speaks language A. So you have to inhibit your desire to speak language B and instead choose language A if you want to be able to communicate effectively with grandma. So think about that. You're intentionally inhibiting one language, suppressing it in order to express the other language, right? So that's a lot of exercise for the executive function network, okay? Also, just so you know, learning L2 stands for language 2, the second language. Your acquisition may be enhanced by music training. And again, this goes to training the auditory cortex to hear rhythm and prosody. Okay, delays. You may have grammatical accuracy come a little later when you're learning your second language. And your vocabulary acquisition. Now, here's a question that comes up a lot. People say, oh yeah, their vocabulary, we tested their vocabulary and their vocabulary isn't developed. Well, they probably only tested their vocabulary in one language. But if you're learning another language, you have vocabulary in both languages, don't you? And if you add those up together, there's no delay. So when you're thinking about vocabulary, make sure you're assessing vocabulary in both or all languages if there's more than two. Okay, and then you add that up, and that will show you if there's a delay or not, right? Because if they're still acquiring all these numbers of words, then there's not a delay. I hope that makes sense. So here's some myth versus fact, all right? Ask yourself these questions. Are these true or not true? Is this a myth? Speaking two or more languages confuses children. Myth or fact? Myth. All children are capable of learning multiple languages, including children with developmental delays and learning disabilities. Myth or fact? It's best to speak the language taught at school with your children, even if you don't speak that language well. Myth or fact? Myth. Families should speak the language they are most comfortable speaking because we have to give children a rich linguistic model of what language is. The richest model we can offer them, no matter the language. It's that depth, that beauty of language that they're going to fall in love with and that their brain is getting trained for. Once they have it in one language, they can get it in others, okay? Myth versus fact. Young bilingual children are delayed in learning language compared to monolingual peers. Myth. Bilingualism does not cause language delays. It's been shown to improve children's executive functions, their ability to learn new words, identify sounds, and problem solve. Okay, but again, that vocabulary may be spread across languages instead of only in one. Myth versus fact. Bilingual children should not mix parts of the languages they speak. Myth. Translanguaging, it's called translanguaging, and it fosters cultural and metalinguistic awareness. What is metalinguistic awareness? It's when you're aware of your use of language. Meta, big picture. Aware of your use of language. And so you're noticing, you'll hear people, we have a lot of Spanish in my community, and so you hear people say, well, that was Spanglish, or, we say Franglish, if French and English, or something like that. So it's common for people to mix languages, and it's not a problem. Myth or fact? Children become bilingual just by listening to people around them speak the second language. It's actually a myth. Learning is active. They have to be engaged in the process. Just hearing is not enough. The brain needs output as well as input. Okay, all of these are from this great website, the Ola blog, and I recommend that you go to it. And this is a summary. They have this one great post for that. I just broke out into those other slides for you. Okay, when you're screening for delays, a lot of people are like, oh, is my multilingual child delayed? Here's what you want to think about. You want to evaluate their phonemic awareness. Can they hear the sounds in the languages that they're speaking? Okay, that's what you're looking at. You want to make sure there's not an auditory problem. I know many of us know children who've had ear infections, chronic ear infections, and that interferes with their ability to read. Now that you understand the importance of spoken language, I think that might make more sense as to why that's true, right? So check their phonemic awareness and their hearing. Make sure their hearing is clear. And when you evaluate vocabulary, you have to evaluate across languages, right? Vocabulary in your first language, you have to add that to your vocabulary level in all of your other languages, and that's your total vocabulary score. And you need to assess receptive vocabulary, not just expressive vocabulary. We know that some children are just not expressing as much. And in Montessori, we call this the 3-period lesson. In the first period, you say, this is phone, right? This is phone. In the second period, you say, show me the phone. And in the third period, you say, what's this? And you're expected to express the vocabulary. It's much more difficult cognitively to come up with that word than it is to recognize it, okay? So receptive vocabulary is their ability to understand without producing. And that can be a difference developmentally. That's normal for children, but it can seem like they don't have language when it's just a receptive versus expressive issue. Okay, here's another quiz. Bilingual children have lower vocabulary levels than monolingual children. True or false? False. Vocabulary delays are accidentally seen if only one language is measured. Okay? All right. Are there bilingual advantages in the brain? Good question. Yes, there are many. Bilingualism may enhance executive functions, and there's some details about this study here, but it's looking at working memory, attention, inhibitory control, task switching, moving from one thing to another, and resolving conflict. Okay, and you can see some results of this study here, but the answer is yes, it looks like there's an executive function benefit. Bilingualism may improve executive function deficits in early childhood. So if you have a child with ADHD, learning another language or simultaneous acquisition or sequential acquisition can actually improve some of their executive function deficits. Again, it's this exercising of those executive function networks, right? And anything we do repeatedly, the brain gets more efficient at. It also can help theory of mind in autism. Now, in autism, one of the cardinal features is that you don't recognize someone else's perspective. You think people understand what you understand, and you don't understand what they understand, right? Theory of mind. So here's a little picture that helps you understand that. But you may, because in autism, think of this, when you're working in a bilingual household or a multilingual household, you look at mom and you know you have to speak language X with her, and you look at dad and you have to speak language Y with dad, okay? So right away, you're starting to think that other people have other perceptions. That's huge, right? Okay, so it may have a theory of mind benefit in autism. And you don't have to start as a child to experience these executive function benefits. And there's a bunch of different research that shows it, and it shows it in different training contexts. So there's not just one way to learn a language, although relationship generally is super helpful. If you can have a relationship with someone so you can actually speak with someone, that makes a huge difference and can make it a lot easier and more fun, depending on who you're speaking with. Bilingualism may also improve metalinguistic awareness, as we mentioned, reaction time on nonverbal tasks, like you can react quicker. And our cognitive reserve. Now, cognitive reserve is how much extra brain availability we have to do something while we're doing something else. Okay, what's our cognitive reserve? What's our extra that we can pull up if we get into a really demanding situation? And that may increase if we're bilingual or multilingual. Now, some studies have failed to replicate this executive function advantage in monolinguals. And so it's not a slam dunk that there are these benefits, but I have to tell you, I think if we do the research well, it's going to be pretty clear, because logically, just thinking about it, it makes a lot of sense. That your inhibitory control will improve, again, because you're suppressing one language to use another. And that your attention and task switching improve because you have to change your attentional focus because, okay, I'm paying attention to who I'm speaking with because they're speaking this language and they're speaking that language, right? And your cognitive flexibility because you have to change. I mean, language isn't just words. It's our whole mode of expression. It's easy to think about this with some romance languages where it's very, very, and they talk, it's like this. It's very expressive physically. And that's the way you communicate in that language. And other languages are very prim and proper, right? Without a lot of other things. Okay. And there's so much melody in different languages too. So we have to be flexible enough to change our whole physical expression when we switch from one language to another. That's huge. So I think when more research happens, you'll see that it's definitely leaning on the side of a benefit. Okay, so bilingualism activates unique brain areas across languages, okay? And it may, because all these other areas are getting active, of course, they're getting stronger. And so we've got these gray matter structures, and I'll show you gray matter in a second, that are sensitive to bilingualism, and white matter tracts sensitive to bilingualism. And all this may result in a delay in cognitive decline when we age. So here we go. You can see in this brain these hairy black looking things, all right? That's actually called gray matter. That's where all the neuronal cell bodies and dendrites hang out. And then these big white tracts, that's axons, myelinated axons, okay? So that's why they call it white matter, is those myelinated axons, and gray matter is the cell bodies and dendrites. So bilingualism does increase white matter, as we said, and here's some research that shows the increased areas. I'm not going to go into the details on it because you can read the study. It's right here. And bilingualism increases gray matter too. And so that means we're getting more dendritic branching at the end of those neurons, which is greater number of connections. And we're upregulating our receptor sites there. So more opportunities for neurotransmitters to come in and have activity in there, right? So that's increasing in bilingualism. And so some of the key benefits to take away with that seem really clear in the research base, is that there's a delayed onset of Alzheimer's and dementia, okay? Because we have more gray matter, think about it, and more white matter means we have more developed brain real estate. So when one area starts to decline, we have other areas that are strong, right? Or we hit little declines around the edges, but not on our main highways in there, okay? Also, we have an increased cognitive reserve when we're bilingual. Really, really useful. We have more availability when the demands come. And we have enhanced working memory. That seems really clear. That aspect of executive functions is increasing. And we have better performance when working memory demands are high. So working memory is the ability to keep something in mind while you're processing it, maybe doing something else. And that's exactly what's happening whenever we're switching languages, right? We're keeping it in mind in this language. We process it maybe in this language. We produce it in this language. Working memory is getting a lot of exercise. Okay, so here's your quiz. You should correct a child when they mix languages or make grammatical errors. True or false? It's tricky. The answer is false. You don't actually want to correct. Instead, you just want to represent it later at a neutral moment, the accurate way to say it. Make sure you come back to it, but in the moment, you don't want to correct. Code switching is normal. It's not a problem, and it sorts itself out with experience. And it also helps the child to develop metalinguistic awareness that we spoke about earlier. It's an aspect of metacognition. Metacognition means thinking about thinking, and it's an important aspect of our academic development later on. So what kills language acquisition? What do we need to keep away from? Stress. It's the worst. Stress is the worst for learning. It's really terrible. It's really terrible. So think about it this way. When we're typically, right now, hopefully you're not under stress and you're just listening to the talk, you're engaged in the talk, you're interested in what's being learned, maybe you're taking notes. Usually that's this front part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex that's kind of in charge. It's called top-down regulation. It's telling the rest of our brain and body what to do. You're alert, you're engaged, everything's running smoothly. There's moderate levels of neurotransmitter release, just the right amount at this time. What happens then? When your boss, your spouse, someone comes in and they, right? What did you just do? And they're angry with you, right? Boom, all of a sudden, your activity leaves this prefrontal cortex and it relocates into your limbic system, your fight or flight area, okay? It moves out of here and here we are. Basal ganglia, habitual responses. You're not thinking clearly with choice. You're just reactive, right? Your amygdala, the fear center, is really going crazy. You get these huge high levels of neurotransmitter release, which has a cost because you're using it up, right? So later when you need it, it's not quite ready to be used again, okay? So this is really tricky. And you can think about it, that shock response, it's literally like that feeling of your activity going from the front of your brain down to your limbic system, okay? Very bad for thinking because look, you need your whole brain to do anything, and especially this prefrontal area is really important for cognition and higher thinking, interpreting and figuring things out. Okay, so stress just boom, moves it out of there, leaves us really bumming, so we're not able to access our brain in the way we need to make good decisions. And that's why when you have that kind of a stress response, someone's like, okay, you messed up. What are you going to do about it? And you're like, I don't know, something comes out of your mouth. You're not quite sure, right? Because you're just parroting, you're reactive. You're not thinking deeply about what's going on, right? So is it a teachable moment when someone tells you, you messed up? No. Because depending on who tells you, if your friend tells you, hey, you were just speaking Spanglish, right? Then you'd be like, oh my gosh, you're right. But if your teacher tells you, hey, you were just speaking Spanglish, you feel differently. You might have that stress response where you wouldn't if a peer tells you. So correction is really tricky. It can cause an acute stress response, and we don't want that. That's really bad for learning. So instead of, in Montessori, we say don't correct, represent. Okay? So later at a neutral moment, you represent the accurate information or you talk about the tricky situation. Okay? That helps. It's huge. Stress is bad for the brain. It also alters memory formation and retrieval. So we remember things differently when we have an acute stress response. We produce these little stress hormones that enhance our consolidation of memory, right? Connecting, pulling it all together, but it impairs our ability to retrieve memories. Think about that. It's a total mismatch. Some memories we have super strong, but we can't retrieve necessarily the ones we truly need. Okay? And we use a whole different part of the brain for those memory formation instead of the typical hippocampal system. Hippocampus meaning the memory area. It looks like a little seahorse in the brain. Okay, processing time and sleep both allow for memory consolidation. Let me just give you a quick example of this research that looked to that. So they had a little mouse with a little cap on, wired up in a little maze, and the mouse goes to place 1, and this part of the place 1 lights up in the brain. Then the mouse goes to place 2 lights up in the brain. Mouse goes to place 3 lights up. Mouse goes to place 4 lights up. Mouse pauses, stops, scratches, sniffs, and what happens to the brain? Place 4, 3, 2, 1, light up. It's the pause that allows the memory to be consolidated, right? So this need for us to pause and internalize what we've just learned is really, really important. Okay, so also get rid of the stress, allow for time. Sleep works in a similar way. During sleep, we actually further consolidate the memories of what happened during the day, which allows us to retrieve more effectively the next day. Okay, and we need sleep for optimal learning. You need adequate sleep before and after learning for that to really work well. Now, a lot of us in this culture, not so good with the sleep, right? A little tricky, really good with the coffee, not so good with just sleep. Okay, we need to really make an intention to shift that, okay? If we want our best brain health, and this is huge for delaying dementia later in life. But I want you to ask yourself right now if you got enough sleep last night. Ask yourself, do you get enough sleep in general? Do you know what enough sleep is? Will you just sleep when you're dead? Okay, so here, what enough sleep is when you wake up without an alarm clock and you feel rested. All right, when's the last time that happened? Hopefully this morning. Okay, wake up without an alarm clock and feel rested. That's what enough sleep is. Now, how much is that? It varies tremendously from person to person. One of my colleagues at Harvard, 5 hours of sleep. That's all she needs every day, which is why she's a prolific researcher and writer, right? She's published everywhere because she just doesn't need as much sleep. Most people, 7 to 8 hours as an adult, sometimes 9, right? But children, look at this. Children, they need tons of sleep. Preschoolers, 10 to 13 hours a day, right? Elementary school, so 9 to 11. And it's not like, 3 kids need 11 hours of sleep. No, there's a large percentage of elementary age children who need that much sleep. And if we don't get it for them, they struggle. They struggle in lots of different ways. We see behavioral challenges. We see academic challenges. Okay, so prioritize sleep. Right? And one of the great ways to do that is to prioritize exercise, physical activity outside, because you sleep better when you get enough exercise. Okay, supporting bilingualism at home. Here are a few little tricks for you. You want to speak all the languages that you know. Really, just speak them. Be rich, just do it, okay? You want to add the second or third languages as entertainment, right? So you can do music, songs, videos, bilingual books, cultural events, fun to go to, computer programs, add those all as entertainment. Like my son loves to play Civ, this computer game. And so he's going to France on an exchange. And so we switched the language for the Civ interface to French. And that's supporting his French development. It was really a simple thing, and now it's fun, and he practices that in French. You want to go to events where the other language is being spoken, and you want to make friends with other people speaking the languages. Now, if you're in a bilingual school, like a Montessori school that's doing language immersion, you've got a whole bunch of people right there who are ready to be your friends and speak other languages with you. So just reach out. And then, of course, learning happens through social relationships. So boom, big bang for that buck. All right. Now, I recommend that you pause to consolidate your own learning and just take a minute, stop the video, pause the video, because I have a couple more things to show you. Pause the video and write down 3 things you didn't know before this talk began, 2 things you'd like to continue to research as your curiosity has been piqued, and 1 thing that you might change in your personal and professional life based on what you just learned. So pause the video, write those things down. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes, okay? And then start again. Okay, so remember that brains are like faces. No 2 are exactly alike, and that's a good thing. Key takeaways I hope you can carry with you from today's talk are anything we do repeatedly, the brain gets more efficient at. So choose skillful things to repeat, and that gets easier over time. Positive relationships are essential for all learning, but particularly when it comes to languages. Stress is really bad for learning. Spoken language is the foundation for all literacy. Start chatting. And I want to leave you with this little quote I love from Dr. Montessori. Courage, my dear, courage. You are a new man that must adapt to this new world. Go on triumphantly. I am here to help you. I love that quote. So I hope this helps. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to my websites, the maitreelearning.com or the Brain Health Initiative, where you can learn more about brain health over the lifespan. And I want to say thank you for attending, and I'll show you all the references that I have in case you want to go deeper into any of this. I'm a stickler for referencing. I want you to be able to see that I'm not making it up. Just a few more screens. And then we're done. Thank you very much. I hope it was helpful.